Why would the first civilization leave behind stone, symbol, and perhaps even a memory of itself, only to vanish so completely that later ages could no longer say its true name? Somewhere between the first altar and the first ruined wall, something seems to have been removed from the human story, not merely broken by time, but softened, covered, and pressed downward into silence, perhaps by flood, perhaps by fire, perhaps by the gentle violence of new empires deciding where history should begin. So before the body yields fully to this quiet, and the mind drifts into that soft borderland between thought and sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the kind of work you enjoy here. And if you wish, share your location and local time below, so this long night of listening may gather its scattered witnesses. In the oldest layers of the world, the earth does not speak clearly. It keeps its secrets in fragments, a worked stone found far from any settlement, a pattern carved into a pillar whose meaning is now carried only by shadows, bones arranged in ways that suggest ritual but refuse explanation, ash where there should have been continuity, silence where there should have been lineage. Historians often describe the beginning of civilization as though it were a sunrise, slow, visible, inevitable, villages becoming towns, towns becoming cities, memory becoming writing, writing becoming history. It is a clean shape, comforting even. But the ground beneath that story is not clean. It is broken, layered, interrupted. And in some places it seems to suggest that humanity remembers less about its beginning than it would like to admit. There is a strange discomfort in the modern imagination whenever the ancient world appears more sophisticated, more symbolic, or more organized than expected. One discovery is adjusted into the timeline, then another, then another. Each new excavation adds detail, but it also deepens the older wound. Because if human beings were capable of creating sacred architecture, coordinated labour, and enduring symbolic systems earlier than once believed, then the question becomes difficult to avoid. How much had already happened before the point where official history begins to feel safe? How many experiments in order, belief, and power rose and disappeared before later civilizations wrote down their own names and declared themselves the first? The unease grows in places where stone outlives explanation. In southeastern Anatolia, at Göbekli Tepe, massive carved pillars stand in circular enclosures far older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than cities in the usual sense. Human hands raised them in an age long associated with mobile hunter-gatherers. Animals move across the stone surfaces in controlled lines, not as decoration in any casual sense, but as part of some world of meaning that remains beyond full recovery. The site was not merely used and abandoned, much of it appears to have been intentionally buried. That detail lingers, a sanctuary hidden by those who knew it best, a centre covered over by deliberate human effort. The act feels ceremonial, but also defensive, as though something was being concluded, sealed, or placed beyond the reach of later eyes. And that is where the first crack opens in the night. Civilizations are supposed to build in order to remain. They raise walls against forgetting. They carve gods into stone so rain and wind cannot erase devotion too quickly. They invent writing because memory fails and generations distort what they inherit. Yet here and there in the deep past, one encounters gestures that seem to move in the opposite direction. Burial instead of display, sealing instead of expansion. Ruin not as the aftermath of chaos, but as a chosen condition. What kind of people conceal their own sacred architecture beneath layers of earth? Was it reverence? Was it fear? Or was it a recognition that knowledge, once exposed to the wrong century, no longer remains intact? The oldest civilization may not have been a single kingdom with a single language and a single throne. That is a desire of a later minds, not necessarily a truth of early humanity. The beginning may have been plural, scattered centres, coastal settlements now underwater, ritual networks without permanent capitals, communities linked by stars, seasons, trade, and myth, rather than by the more familiar machinery of empire? If so, then the phrase first civilization may already be misleading. It may refer not to the first people who organized sacred space, counted time, observed the heavens, buried their dead with meaning, or built monuments to invisible orders. It may only refer to the first whose records remained legible to those who later dominated the archives. This possibility is less dramatic than legend and more troubling, because it suggests that disappearance does not require fantasy. It does not require lost supercontinents or machines beyond imagination. It requires only what the Earth has always done well: rising water, shifting riverbeds, sediment, erosion, earthquake, drought, fire, migration. And beside these, what human beings have always done to one another: conquest, replacement, simplification, renaming. A destroyed city can be remembered for a few generations. A drowned coastline can become a myth. A sacred hill can be quarried by descendants who no longer know what stood there before. A script can vanish when the last trained reader dies. Then, after enough centuries, later peoples inherit stones without sentences and build their certainty on top of them. There is another problem, quieter but perhaps more serious. Even when evidence survives, interpretation arrives late. It arrives with the assumptions of the present. Entire ages were once called primitive, simply because they had not yet yielded the kinds of artifacts scholars were trained to prioritize. Monumental architecture reorders those assumptions. Sophisticated astronomical alignments reorders them again. Symbolic continuity across regions begins to trouble the old certainties further. Each discovery does not merely fill a gap. Sometimes it reveals that the gap was much larger than anyone had wanted to see. This is why the beginning feels haunted. Not because every theory of forgotten antiquity deserves belief, but because the official story of origins has repeatedly had to expand under pressure from stone, sediment, genetics, and landscape. The past has not remained still. It keeps returning, revised. And whenever it returns, it carries the faint suggestion that humanity has inherited not a complete memory, but a curated remainder, a remnant shaped by survival, accident, and power. What was preserved may be true, but it may not be whole, and what was lost may not have been trivial. Somewhere in that thought lies the deeper unease. The first civilization, whatever form it took, may not have vanished in one apocalyptic gesture. It may have been thinned out over centuries, translated badly, broken into folklore, submerged beneath literal water and metaphorical certainty. Later worlds may have looked back through the fog and mistaken inheritance for origin. They may have stood in the ruins of something older and thought they were standing at the beginning. So the question is not only who those first builders were, it is who benefited when their outline blurred. Was their disappearance merely the consequence of time's patient erosion? Or did later systems of order, religion and empire quietly prefer a simpler dawn for humanity? One easier to control, easier to teach, easier to bless. If the oldest human memory was fragmented on purpose as much as by accident, then the silence at the foundation of civilization is not empty at all. It is occupied. And under that silence, waiting beneath the first layer of accepted history, there may already be another buried door. A buried door suggests a buried landscape. Once that thought enters the room, it becomes difficult to dismiss. The question no longer rests only on forgotten temples or symbols whose language has gone dark. It moves outward, toward the edges of continents, toward shelves of land now hidden beneath cold green water, toward shorelines that existed when memory had not yet learned to write itself down. If the earliest organized cultures lived near rivers, estuaries, or coasts, as so many later civilizations did, then an uncomfortable possibility waits beneath the map itself. Some of the first chapters may not have been destroyed in the ordinary sense. They may simply be underwater, sealed beneath silt and pressure, preserved and erased at the same time. Modern people inherit the planet in its current outline and often forget how temporary that outline is. The coast feels permanent only because one lifetime is too short to watch a sea claim a world. Yet the ending of the last ice age transformed shorelines across the globe. Ice sheets retreated, water rose, vast plains that once welcomed migration, hunting, settlement, and perhaps early ritual exchange disappeared beneath expanding seas. What now appears to be open water was, not so long before the first cities, dry land. Not mythic land, not imagined land, but real terrain where human beings walked, built hearths, buried their dead, and watched horizons from places now unreachable without sonar and steel. This alters the emotional geometry of the question. It is one thing to imagine a lost civilization as fantasy, some impossible empire placed safely beyond criticism. It is another to realize that countless human landscapes truly were drowned by post-glacial sea level rise, and that archaeology, for all its patience, has always been more comfortable on land than under moving water. The deeper one thinks about that, the stranger the silence becomes. How much has been taken from the record not because it never existed, but because the sea is better at keeping secrets than the desert? A wall on a mountain can survive for millennia. A village on a drowned plain may vanish from ordinary history almost completely. The earliest builders, if they existed in forms still unfamiliar to modern categories, would likely have chosen the same gifts later civilizations chose: water, fertile sediment, seasonal abundance, movement, exchange. Rivers fed grain, coasts invited travel, estuaries connected inland life to distant shores. Yet these are exactly the environments most vulnerable to change. A rising ocean does not argue with memory. It lifts it, softens it, pulls it apart, and leaves behind only displaced fragments. Perhaps that is why so many ancient traditions remember rupture through the language of flood. Not because every tale must preserve one single event, but because water was among the first great editors of human continuity. There is something almost cruel in the elegance of this process. What the earliest communities needed in order to flourish may also have guaranteed that their traces would be difficult to recover. The places best suited for beginnings were often the least suited for permanence. A settlement near an ancient shoreline could live for generations and then disappear without the theatrical violence of conquest. No great army would be required, no bonfire of records, only time, climate, melting ice, and a patient tide. The result would look, from a distance of thousands of years, almost like deliberate erasure. And perhaps that resemblance is what continues to trouble the imagination. Nature can imitate intention with unnerving precision, but water alone does not explain everything. Even on land, the prehistory of organized life is unevenly visible. Some regions preserve stone circles, ritual enclosures, or dense symbolic art. Others preserve almost nothing. The imbalance tempts people into mistaken certainty. What survives begins to define what is believed possible. What is missing begins to be treated as if it never happened. And yet absence is not proof of emptiness. It may simply be proof of fragile materials, unstable terrain, or the cruel bias of preservation. Wood rots, reeds collapse, coastlines migrate. Languages disappear without leaving dictionaries behind. Human sophistication does not always fossilize itself in the forms later scholars most easily recognize. This is why the idea of a first civilization remains unstable. The term suggests a visible threshold, a point at which humanity crossed from one condition into another, but thresholds look clearer in textbooks than in Earth. Real transitions blur. Ritual may precede agriculture in one place. Monumentality may emerge before urban density in another. Long-distance exchange may connect scattered communities before anyone would call them a state. The early world may have been full of experiments in social order, some brief, some seasonal, some sacred rather than administrative, some impressive enough to alter memory yet too fragile to resist climate and time. If those experiments took place on now drowned coasts, then what later ages remembered as the beginning may only be what remained after the water finished choosing. There is a haunting irony in that. Later civilizations often told stories about surviving a flood and rebuilding order afterward. Such stories are frequently read either too literally or too dismissively. Yet somewhere between those extremes lies a more human possibility. What if flood traditions endure because many communities, across long stretches of prehistory, experienced genuine environmental loss, shorelines retreating, river systems changing, ancestral places swallowed or transformed? The story would not need to preserve measurements or dates to preserve truth. Trauma rarely remembers like a surveyor. It remembers in images, a great water, a broken world, survivors carrying fragments of custom into unfamiliar land. If so, then the silence surrounding the earlier civilization may not be the silence of total annihilation. It may be the silence of translation. A real event becomes ritual language. A drowned settlement becomes a sacred warning. A vanished coast becomes the homeland before the waters. Generations pass. Priests inherit the story but not the geography. Scribes inherit the theme but not the original landscape. By the time writing arrives in durable form, the first memory has already been filtered through song, theology, and loss. What remains is meaningful but no longer precise. That should make the listener cautious, not credulous. Not every submerged formation is a lost city. Not every myth is a map. But neither should the past be flattened into the limits of current visibility. Archaeology continues to find evidence of ancient shoreline occupation, drowned structures, and unexpectedly early complexity. Each discovery is modest on its own. None solves the old mystery. Yet together they produce a subtle pressure, a pressure against certainty itself. The pressure says that the first world of organized human meaning may have been larger, more distributed, and more vulnerable than the later record admits. And once that pressure is felt, another question begins to rise from beneath it. If nature erased so much of the earliest landscape, who decided how the survivors would remember what was left? Water may drown a coast, but it does not compose an official origin. Someone always does that later. Someone gathers fragments, names the beginning, arranges the ancestors, chooses which ruins belong to history and which belong only to legend. The sea may have hidden the first traces, but the next veil perhaps was laid by human hands. The sea may have hidden the first traces, but the next veil was not woven by water. It was woven by memory once memory learned to serve power. A drowned coast can erase a village. A shifting river can swallow a shrine, but only human hands can gather fragments of the past, arrange them into sequence, and declare with quiet confidence that this is where the story begins. That is where the deeper unease begins to settle. Because the moment a civilization starts writing down its origins, it is no longer merely remembering, it is selecting, it is shaping, it is deciding which ancestors deserve permanence and which earlier shadows will remain outside the lamp's reach. In the ancient Near East, one of the most haunting examples of this appears in the old king lists of Mesopotamia. At first glance, such documents seem like gifts from the deep past, orderly attempts to preserve succession, legitimacy, and chronology. Names follow names. Cities rise, rule, and give way to others. The world appears anchored by sequence. But the longer one lingers over these records, the stranger they become. Some reigns stretch across impossibly long spans, far beyond the limits of ordinary human life. Dynasties begin before a great flood and continue after it, as though history itself had been broken and resumed. Certain cities are elevated, others diminished. What presents itself as remembrance also feels like arrangement. The text does not simply preserve memory, it edits it into authority. That detail matters more than it first appears to. When a civilization claims to remember the earliest rulers of the world, it is doing something greater than simple record-keeping. It is defining legitimacy. It is saying, in effect, that power has a sacred lineage, that order descends through chosen places, chosen names, chosen hands. The past becomes a foundation stone for the present. And once that happens, the temptation to simplify the beginning becomes nearly irresistible. The older, messier world of overlapping cultures, vanished communities, lost coastlines, wandering ritual traditions and broken continuities begins to harden into a cleaner procession. The result is easier to teach, easier to govern through, and easier to bless. One can almost feel the tension between genuine preservation and political usefulness. The ancient scribes were not necessarily deceivers in any crude sense. They lived inside inherited traditions, copied older materials, and believed they were safeguarding the structure of memory against oblivion. Yet sincerity does not protect a record from distortion. In some ways, sincere transmission can make the distortion more powerful, because each generation receives the arranged version as if it were simply the world itself. A list of kings becomes more than a list. It becomes a ladder descending into sacred time, and anything not attached to that ladder begins to look unreal, secondary, or dangerous. This is how absence acquires authority. Once an official origin takes root, what lies outside it becomes difficult to see. A people without a place in the sanctioned sequence becomes marginal. A monument without a named dynasty becomes mysterious but politically harmless. A flood story without a palace archive becomes myth rather than history. Little by little, the unwritten past is pushed toward the edge of credibility, not because it never happened, but because it cannot easily be fitted into the lines drawn by those who inherited the right to name the beginning. The old Mesopotamian world understood something profound about rule, that power does not merely occupy the present, it reaches backward. It claims ancestors, divine favour, and continuity with the first order of things. To possess the story of origins is to command more than memory. It is to command meaning. This is why temples, courts, and archives were never neutral spaces. They stored grain, law, ritual, and names, but they also stored permission. They decided whose version of the past would travel forward intact. In that sense, the first great archives may also have been the first great filters. And then there is the flood dividing the old lists, that solemn rupture between a world before and a world after. Whether read as symbolic memory, theological pattern, or distant reflection of real environmental upheaval, it performs a remarkable function. It allows continuity to survive through catastrophe. The world is broken, but order returns. Kingship descends again. The sequence resumes. The effect is almost liturgical. Chaos intervenes, but legitimacy remains. Yet one might ask, very softly, what was washed away in the telling itself? If a civilization remembers a rupture, but preserves only the line that leads to later authority, then catastrophe becomes not only a disaster of nature, but an opportunity of narrative. The flood destroys, and afterward the authorized world begins. Perhaps that is why the first civilization feels so difficult to approach directly. By the time literate societies speak about what came before them, they are already standing inside systems that need a usable ancestry. Their records may preserve echoes of astonishing antiquity, but those echoes arrive through institutions built to stabilize the present. The earliest truth, whatever shape it had, reaches us already filtered through temple logic, dynastic pride, and scribal discipline. Even where honesty is present, wholeness is not guaranteed. This does not make the records worthless. It makes them human, and perhaps that is more unsettling. Because modern readers often prefer to imagine falsification as a deliberate plot, something sharp and obvious. But the oldest distortions may have been slower than that, almost tender in their own way. A copied tablet, a favoured city, an inherited formula, a sacred genealogy repeated until it no longer feels chosen. No one needs to burn the earlier world if they can simply narrate around it. The result is the same in the long run. What is excluded fades. What is repeated survives. The listener may begin to notice how familiar this is. Every age inherits fragments and arranges them according to its needs. Every order imagines its own foundations more clearly than the foundations truly were. The past is not only discovered, it is continually domesticated. Jagged beginnings are softened into acceptable beginnings. Discontinuities become transitions. Lost experiments in human organization become prelude. Whatever does not lead smoothly toward the present is treated as incidental, even if it once held the center of someone's world. That is where the question darkens. If the earliest civilization did not leave behind a single empire, but a scattered human complexity later simplified by official memory, then perhaps erasure did not happen once. Perhaps it happened in layers. First, through flood, migration, and environmental rupture. Then through the narrowing work of archives. Then through the authority of kingdoms and priesthoods that needed history to speak in a voice both orderly and obedient. By the time later generations looked backward, they may have been staring through several veils at once, mistaking the visible remainder for the whole original body, and still something resists complete burial. Certain names remain too old, too strange, too detached from later certainty. Certain myths preserve fractures they do not fully explain. Certain monuments refuse to align with the neat progression of accepted beginnings. It is as though the deeper past, though muted, continues pressing upward through the arranged surface of history, like roots under stone. So the question grows more intimate now. If human beings have always shaped origins to protect the present, then what else was trimmed away before the record became respectable? What kinds of teachers, rituals, settlements, or older inheritances were left outside the gate when the first authorized memory was composed? The tablets remain, but they may not be alone in speaking. Somewhere beyond the official line of kings, another form of testimony may still be waiting, less orderly, less obedient, and perhaps much older than the scribes wished to admit. Somewhere beyond the official line of kings, another testimony may still be speaking, though not in the language of archives. It does not arrive in orderly columns or dynastic formulas. It appears instead as a recurring image, almost too large for history and too persistent for coincidence. Water rising where memory once stood. Again and again, across separated civilizations, there appears the same wound in different garments, a great inundation, a world cut in two. Survivors carrying fragments of lore, craft, sacrifice, or sacred knowledge into a diminished age. The details vary, as all human memories do, but the shape remains, a before, a breaking, an after that never fully heals. Later minds often approach such stories with a certain impatience. Either they are treated as literal records of one global catastrophe, or they are dismissed as the predictable inventions of religious imagination. But perhaps that division is too convenient. Human beings do not remember disaster like engineers. They remember through fear, symbol, repetition, and moral pattern. A flood in memory may preserve many floods at once, just as a ruined city in legend may carry the weight of several real destructions layered together until the original event can no longer be separated from the meaning it acquired. What survives is not always precise, but it is rarely empty. This is where the older question begins to shift. The problem may not be whether there was one flood that shattered the first civilization. The problem may be whether repeated environmental ruptures, occurring across long stretches of prehistory and early history, were severe enough to fracture continuity so deeply that later civilizations inherited only symbolic echoes of what came before. If ancestral settlements were repeatedly abandoned, river systems repeatedly altered, and coastlines repeatedly lost, then humanity may have learned very early that memory itself had to become portable. It could no longer depend on place alone. It had to be sung, ritualized, mythologized, and entrusted to forms capable of surviving when the landscape did not. In Mesopotamian tradition, the flood marks a terrible division in the story of rule. In biblical literature, the waters erase corruption and preserve only a narrow remnant. In Greek memory, Deucalion survives while the old world is washed away. In Indian tradition, Manu is warned and guided through destruction. One does not need to flatten these traditions into sameness to feel their shared gravity. Water is never merely weather in such accounts. It is a boundary between ages. The old order becomes inaccessible. The survivors inherit not continuity, but burden. They must begin again, and yet they are haunted by the sense that beginning again is not the same as truly beginning. That distinction matters. A civilization recovering from rupture may tell itself that it is founding the world, when in truth it is rebuilding on top of fragments it no longer fully understands. This possibility gives flood memory a more intimate sadness. The survivor does not only lose land, the survivor loses context. Sacred places are gone, genealogies break, technologies survive partially, stripped from the worldview that once gave them meaning. Rituals continue, but their original reasons dim. The next culture inherits pieces of a shattered whole and mistakes inheritance for invention. Thus the first civilization may vanish, not because every trace is destroyed, but because later societies continue its remnants without recognizing their true age. Geology, quiet and untheatrical, lends this suspicion a certain weight. The end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene brought immense changes to climate, sea level, vegetation, and the movement of water through entire regions. River valleys shifted, glacial lakes failed, coastal plains disappeared. Habitats that had supported human communities for generations became unstable or vanished altogether. Even without imagining a single universal cataclysm, one can see how environmental upheaval might repeatedly sever local continuities. The Earth did not need to destroy every human settlement at once. It needed only to destroy enough of them, in enough key places, often enough for memory to become uneven and survival to outrun preservation. And when memory becomes uneven, power enters quietly. Those who remain, or those who rise later, begin to interpret the rupture. They decide which lessons the flood meant to teach. Moral failure may be blamed. Divine anger may be invoked. A chosen lineage may be preserved in the telling while others vanish. What began as ecological trauma becomes theological order. What was once loss becomes doctrine. In this way, catastrophe is never remembered naked. It is clothed by the institutions that survive it. There is something almost inevitable in that transformation. People do not endure destruction by preserving data alone. They endure by giving suffering a shape. They bind chaos into story so that descendants may carry it without being crushed by it. Yet every act of shaping creates exclusion. What the story emphasizes, it saves. What it cannot carry, it lets sink. A flood myth can preserve the memory of rupture with astonishing durability, but it can also erase the precise human complexity that existed before the water. The vanished world becomes generalized, moralized, simplified. The old civilization is no longer remembered as a network of actual lives and places. It becomes the age before judgment, the world before corruption, the land before the waters. That may be one reason the earliest civilization remains so difficult to see clearly. If its destruction or fragmentation was filtered through catastrophe memory, then later traditions may preserve the emotional truth of its loss while obscuring the historical texture of its existence. They remember that something ended. They do not remember it in a way that satisfies a modern map. And so the listener stands in a difficult space between skepticism and recognition. Too much belief turns every myth into a newspaper. Too much dismissal turns every recurring memory into decoration. Neither posture feels sufficient. The older world may have disappeared in stages, leaving behind pockets of continuity like islands after the sea has risen. One community preserves a ritual calendar. Another preserves a star tradition. Another preserves burial customs, flood warnings, a sacred mountain, a forbidden plain, a lawgiver carried through waters, a vessel of survival, a covenant after destruction. No single remnant contains the whole. But together they suggest that the break between prehistory and history was not clean. It was traumatic, it was interpreted, and above all, it was incomplete. Perhaps that incompleteness is what still troubles the modern mind. If civilization can survive its own breaking only by mythologizing what was lost, then the official beginning of history may already be a recovered world speaking in the language of survivors. What is called the dawn may in fact be the aftermath. What is called the first kingdom may be only the first kingdom after memory drowned. And if so, then the silence surrounding humanity's earliest organized past is not a blank space at all. It is a shoreline after retreat, where one can still find shells, bones, and carved fragments, but no longer the living city that gave them form. This leaves a quieter and more unsettling thought. Water may have torn open the first great gap in memory, but the flood did not choose what would later be taught. Human beings did that. Priests, scribes, dynasts, and keepers of sacred order inherited the stories of rupture and arranged them into meaning. Somewhere in that arrangement, some details were preserved with reverence, and others were allowed to disappear forever. So the question that rises now is not simply what the waters took. It is what the survivors, in fear or in wisdom, chose not to carry across. What the survivors chose not to carry across may be more revealing than anything they preserved. Silence, after all, is rarely empty. In the oldest human stories, what vanishes is not only land, not only cities, not only names. Entire ways of seeing the world seem to fall out of reach. What remains is a broken inheritance, a sacred object without its full meaning, a pattern repeated long after its purpose fades, a warning handed down through myth after the physical landscape that inspired it has already disappeared. And once that thought settles in, another possibility begins to move in the dark behind it. Perhaps the first civilization was not erased by one event alone, but by a chain of shocks so deep that later generations inherited fragments without knowing they were fragments. Among the most debated attempts to explain such a rupture is the cluster of arguments surrounding the Younger Dryas, a dramatic return to near-glacial conditions that began roughly 12,900 years ago, near the end of the last ice age. In academic discussion, the basic climatic shift itself is not the controversy. The Earth did enter a sudden cold reversal. The greater dispute concerns what triggered it, how abrupt its local effects may have been, and whether catastrophic mechanisms played a role in reshaping habitats, migration routes, and the human world standing at the threshold of a new era. Some researchers have argued for a cosmic impact or airburst event, pointing to microspherules, melt-like materials, soot, and other signatures they interpret as evidence of a violent episode. Others have criticized those interpretations, challenged the methods, and rejected the broader hypothesis as unproven. The argument remains unsettled. And perhaps that very unsettled quality is what makes it so haunting. Because beneath the technical debate lies a more human question. What would abrupt planetary instability feel like to people whose memory was oral, whose survival depended intimately on season, herd movement, plant cycles, and the reliability of familiar ground? A sharp cooling, fire across some landscapes, disrupted rainfall, vanishing prey in one region, overwhelming meltwater in another, entire corridors of migration altered, ancient camps abandoned, sacred routes severed. One does not need to accept the strongest catastrophic claims to feel the force of the underlying possibility. The end of the Ice Age was not a smooth awakening into civilization. It was a threshold crossed through environmental stress, adaptation, and loss. That matters because the imagination is often tempted by two equally misleading pictures of the distant past. In one, prehistoric humanity appears simple, passive, almost static, waiting patiently for civilization to arrive. In the other, one imagines impossible vanished empires equipped with everything later ages admire. Reality may be more subtle and more unsettling than either. Human communities at the close of the Pleistocene were capable of symbolic thought, ritual behaviour, long-distance movement, ecological intelligence, and social coordination of considerable complexity. They did not need to resemble later states in order to build meaningful worlds, and meaningful worlds, once broken, can leave behind damage far greater than the archaeological record initially suggests. A climate shock does not merely destroy structures, it destroys confidence in repetition. It teaches a population that the sky no longer behaves, that rivers cannot be trusted, that migration routes once followed by ancestors now end in emptiness. It interrupts the agreement between memory and landscape. Once that agreement fails, continuity becomes fragile. The old ceremonial place may no longer be reachable. The seasonal gathering may no longer occur. A burial ground may disappear under water or ice or shifting sediment. Then, over generations, practical adaptation overtakes recollection. Survival chooses what stays, and what stays is rarely the whole. This is where the debated catastrophe models become useful, even when they are not conclusive. Their deepest value may not lie in proving a single dramatic event beyond dispute, but in forcing modern thought to confront how vulnerable early human continuity truly was. The older story of civilization often rests on an assumption of gradual accumulation. Knowledge builds, habits stabilize, settlement deepens, complexity grows. Yet the late Ice Age world did not guarantee such smooth inheritance. Gains could be interrupted, ritual centres could be abandoned, networks could fragment and reform elsewhere under new pressures. In such a world, the first civilization would not need to be fully destroyed to become unrecognisable. It would only need to be scattered, translated through trauma, and resumed in diminished forms by descendants who no longer knew the scale of what had preceded them. There is a melancholy dignity in that image, not the spectacle of a lost golden empire swallowed overnight, but something quieter, communities carrying splinters of older order through generations of instability. A star tradition survives, but detached from the original structure that organised it. A pattern of monumental building reappears, but in a changed symbolic language. A myth of fire from heaven, darkened skies, bitter cold, or devouring waters persists, though no one can date the first wound anymore. The descendants do not lie. They remember as human beings remember after a rupture too large to preserve intact. And this may be why the archaeological record sometimes feels as though it is lit in flashes rather than continuously. A site appears that seems surprisingly early, surprisingly organised, surprisingly symbolic, then long distances of silence, then another emergence elsewhere under altered conditions. It can be tempting to interpret the gaps as emptiness, but gaps are not always emptiness. Sometimes they are the footprints of interruption. Sometimes they are what history looks like after climate, migration, and selective memory have done their work together. The Younger Dryas debate lingers precisely because it touches this vulnerable seam between geology and human meaning. Whether one accepts the impact hypothesis, rejects it, or suspends judgment, the deeper implication remains disturbing. Human beginnings unfolded under conditions more unstable than older models once preferred. Civilization, in its earliest forms, may have stood not on calm foundations but on recovering ground, and if so, then the desire for a clean origin becomes even more suspect. What later ages called the beginning may already have been a reconstruction, a second attempt, a reordered inheritance after damage whose original scale could no longer be fully narrated. This does not license every extravagant theory. The past deserves more discipline than that. But discipline should not harden into comfort. It should remain open to the possibility that early complexity existed in forms too fragile, too interrupted, or too poorly preserved to fit neatly within inherited timelines. The silence between known sites may conceal not fantasy, but lost context. The absence of direct proof may reflect not absence of life, but the brutal mathematics of survival and preservation. and then another thought presses closer. If natural catastrophe, whether sudden or cumulative, fractured the earliest human worlds, what happened afterward to the surviving fragments? They did not remain untouched. They passed into the hands of later communities, later priesthoods, later systems of meaning. A climate rupture may break the body of a civilization, but interpretation decides what spirit will be said to emerge from its ruins. Once the ground stabilizes, someone always begins to explain what the disaster meant. Someone always claims the authority to name the survivors, to sanctify their memory, to define what must be remembered and what must be left behind. So perhaps the first great erasure was not a single wave of destruction, but a sequence: environmental shock, broken transmission, selective survival, and finally interpretation. The old world fractures, the fragments travel, the descendants shape them into stories they can bear. Then institutions rise and arrange those stories into doctrine, legitimacy, and order. By the time history begins to look solid, much has already been softened, omitted, or transformed. The catastrophe is over, but its second life has only begun. And that is the darker edge of this chapter. If the earliest human inheritance passed through rupture before it passed into writing, then the record later civilizations preserved may already be the product of deep compression. Not false, perhaps, but thinned. Not invented, but disciplined by necessity. Which raises a final uneasy question for the night. If natural upheaval first shattered the memory of the earliest world, who later decided how those broken pieces should be arranged, and what sacred authority gave them the right to do so? What sacred authority gave later hands the right to arrange the broken pieces of the earliest world? The question does not arrive with noise. It arrives the way dust settles over stone, slowly enough that no one notices the covering until the original surface has already changed. By the time organized religion, priesthood, and dynastic rule begin to dominate the visible record, the oldest human memory is no longer raw. It has already passed through loss, migration, reinterpretation, and fear. What remains is fragile, and fragile things, once inherited by institutions, are rarely left untouched. They are preserved, yes, but also framed, narrowed, sanctified, and, when necessary, concealed. There is a tendency to imagine concealment as something dramatic. Hidden chambers, sealed vaults, forbidden scrolls. The imagination enjoys those shapes because they are easy to recognize. Yet the deeper concealment in history is often more ordinary than that. A sacred site is reused, and the earlier meaning fades beneath the later one. A local god is absorbed into a larger pantheon, and the original cult survives only as a name. A ritual continues, but the cosmology that gave it force is replaced. A monument is buried, not to destroy it, but to close it. A temple is not always shattered. Sometimes it is domesticated. Sometimes it's covered with reverence so complete that the older world beneath it becomes unreachable. This is one reason the intentionally buried sites of prehistory carry such unusual weight. At places like Göbekli Tepe, the act of burial does not look like random ruin. It looks purposeful, measured, almost liturgical. Huge carved pillars, arranged in enclosures that required planning, labour and symbolic cohesion, were eventually enclosed under fill. Whatever else one believes about the meaning of the site, this detail remains difficult to ignore. It suggests a civilization, or at least a ritual culture, capable not only of building sacred architecture, but of deciding when such architecture had to be hidden from the open world. The decision matters. Burial changes memory. Once a sacred place disappears beneath earth, later generations no longer inherit it directly. They inherit only rumour, displaced symbolism, or silence. And perhaps that is where concealment truly begins. Not with destruction, but with interruption of access. If a site is no longer visible, the meaning attached to it cannot travel in the same way. It has to be carried by people instead of stone. It becomes vulnerable to abbreviation, transformation, and hierarchy. Priests emerge. Specialists of remembrance emerge. The sacred no longer belongs to everyone equally. It becomes concentrated in certain hands, guarded by initiation, language, or place. The more unstable the world becomes, the more tempting such concentration must have seemed. Knowledge can be protected by making it selective. Meaning can survive by becoming secret. This possibility should not be exaggerated into fantasy, but neither should it be dismissed. Across many ancient cultures, sacred knowledge was not treated as something to be scattered carelessly. Ritual formulas, celestial observations, burial practices, initiation mysteries, and the architecture of temples were often controlled by narrow groups. That control may have preserved material that would otherwise have vanished. But preservation through control has a price. It creates layers. It decides who may know and in what form. It can pass something onward while altering its social meaning completely. What may once have belonged to a wider communal world becomes enclosed within official custody. A pattern begins to emerge here, and it is less theatrical than conspiracy, but perhaps more unsettling. The first civilization, or the first network of civilizations, if the beginning was plural, may have lost much to flood, climate, and migration. Then, from what remained, later guardians of sacred order may have inherited fragments and transformed them into restricted memory. They may not have been villains in any simple sense. Often they were preservers. Without priestly classes, scribal schools, temple economies, and ritual continuity, much would have disappeared entirely. Yet the very act of preservation through institution changes the thing preserved. It fixes it inside doctrine. It trims away ambiguity. It chooses one authorized path through a once wider field of meanings. This is why the most enduring erasures rarely look like violence at first. They look like care. A tradition is codified so it may survive. A myth is standardized so it may be repeated. A sacred calendar is fixed. A genealogy is purified. A forbidden chamber is sealed. A sanctuary is closed to ordinary eyes. Each gesture appears protective, and perhaps it is. But protection can also become separation, and separation eventually becomes amnesia for those left outside the inner circle. The people remember the outer form, while the interpretive key narrows into fewer and fewer hands. When those hands are later broken by invasion, reform, or collapse, what survives is the shell of the tradition, not always its heart. One begins to understand how a civilization might erase itself without ever intending self-destruction. All it must do is transfer too much meaning from open landscape into guarded custody. Once sacred knowledge becomes centralized, it becomes both stronger and more vulnerable. Stronger because it can be disciplined, repeated, archived, ritualized. More vulnerable because if the center fails, entire worlds of interpretation fail with it. A village tradition can fade gradually. A temple-centered cosmology can suffer a catastrophic break. The body remains, but the breath leaves. Monuments endure, symbols endure, yet what they once unlocked is gone. Ancient burial, then, may sometimes have been more than disposal or reverence. It may have been a threshold technology of memory. To bury is to decide that something should continue in hidden form. To seal is to announce that ordinary time is no longer fit for what lies beneath. The earth becomes not merely a grave, but an archive without readers. And once enough of a culture's core meanings are transferred into hidden archives, literal or symbolic, the civilization begins to disappear even while some of its forms remain on the surface. This leads to a quieter suspicion about the first civilization. Perhaps its trace was not erased because it left nothing behind. Perhaps it was erased because what it left behind was too sacred, too dangerous, too unstable, or too context-bound to remain public after rupture. Later ages may have stood near the ruins of an older symbolic order and chosen concealment over continuation. They may have buried what they could not decode safely, institutionalized what they could use, and mythologized what they could no longer explain. In that sense, the disappearance of the earliest world would not be a single event. It would be a slow conversion of living memory into protected fragments. And once protected fragments enter the custody of later systems, the question of motive grows darker. Did those later keepers hide the past to honour it, fearing its corruption? Did they restrict access because the old knowledge no longer fit the new world? Or did they discover, as institutions often do, that control over the sacred also grants control over people? The answer may not be singular. Reverence and power have often walked together. The hand that preserves is not always innocent, even when it believes itself holy. This is where the buried earth begins to feel almost psychological. Human beings hide what they cannot destroy and fear to expose. Civilizations do something similar. They bury origins that threaten the legitimacy of the present. They cover over phases of development that appear too fragmented, too plural, too uncertain for later narratives of chosen order. A clean ancestry is easier to govern than a broken one. A sacred beginning is easier to protect than a contested one. And if the earlier civilization was not a neat origin but a field of interrupted experiments, then every later system built on inherited certainty had a quiet incentive to simplify it. So beneath the enclosures, beneath the temple mounds, beneath the polished stories of lawful descent, there may still lie an older human habit to hide what once mattered most, not always to destroy it, not always even to lie about it, sometimes simply because the world had changed and the old centre could no longer stand in daylight without unsettling everything built afterward. That thought leaves behind a troubling final image, a sacred landscape sealed by those who knew it, a lineage of guardians inheriting fragments whose full meaning had already dimmed, a later world arranging those fragments into accepted truth while deeper layers slept below. If concealment became one of the first responses to civilizational rupture, then what disappeared from human memory may not be waiting only in drowned coasts or shattered ruins. It may also be waiting in symbols still visible everywhere, repeated across ages, carrying meanings no longer spoken aloud. And that raises the next question with unusual force. If the outer form survived but the inner language was lost, then how much of the first civilization still stands before human eyes? Unread? How much of the first civilization still stands before human eyes? Unread? The question carries a particular kind of sadness, because unreadability is a more intimate form of disappearance than ruin. A collapsed wall still announces that something once stood. A broken statue still implies a hand, a face, a world of intention. But an unread symbol is more unsettling. It survives in full view while withholding itself completely. It is presence without access, nearness without entry. The message remains, but the door inside the message has been sealed, and if the earliest civilization left behind not only stones, but systems of meaning now beyond recovery, then perhaps humanity has not merely lost its beginning. It may be looking at fragments of that beginning constantly, without any remaining ability to hear what they were trying to say. There is a dangerous comfort in objects. Modern minds often trust what can be measured, weighed, photographed, and placed in glass. A tablet feels more secure than a legend. An inscription feels more obedient than a prayer passed through generations of memory. Yet writing itself is fragile in ways stone is not. A sign survives only as long as the code survives with it. Once the chain of readers breaks, the text does not gradually fade into half-meaning. It becomes a silent arrangement of marks. The body remains. The voice leaves. And when the voice leaves, later ages may preserve the artifact faithfully while losing the world that gave it life. That is why the graveyard of human scripts feels so different from ordinary archaeology. To stand before an undeciphered inscription is to stand at the edge of a human absence almost impossible to measure. The symbols may be beautifully cut, the material may endure for millennia, but without the living bridge of language, even the most careful observer is forced into humility. This has happened more than once in the human story. Scripts have flourished, organized trade, ritual, administration, and identity, only to fall silent when the institution supporting them collapsed. Sometimes a language survives while its writing system disappears. Sometimes the writing remains, but no bilingual key is ever found. Sometimes entire archives exist, but the civilization behind them remains half-veiled because the grammar of its thought has become unreachable. The history of decipherment itself reveals how contingent memory truly is. Egyptian hieroglyphs, for centuries, were admired more as sacred images than understood as writing, until the Rosetta Stone provided the bridge that allowed scholars to recover much of their structure. Cuneiform, once pressed into clay across Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond, lay unread until patient comparison, multilingual inscriptions, and extraordinary intellectual labour reopened its buried speech. Linear B yielded its secret in the 20th century, altering perceptions of the ancient Aegean. And still, other scripts remain unresolved, or only partly understood. The symbols of the Indus Valley continue to provoke debate over whether they encode language in a full writing system or something more compact and administrative. Rongorongo on Easter Island remains deeply contested and obscure. Linear A still resists full decipherment, surviving like a closed window beside the later script that could at last be read. Each undeciphered script is a warning. Civilization is not lost only when its cities burn. It is lost when its signs detach from their speakers. 1,000 tablets can survive the death of a library if no one remains who can rebuild the bridge between mark and mind. And what is true of script may be true in subtler ways of architecture, ritual gesture, spatial arrangement, and symbol itself. A people may inherit a pattern and repeat it with reverence long after its original interpretive core has thinned into habit. The form remains active, the meaning drifts. Eventually, even the drift is forgotten, and what began as a living expression of cosmology hardens into decoration, superstition, or unexplained custom. This possibility becomes especially important when thinking about the first civilization, or the earliest web of human cultures complex enough to organize symbols across generations. Their knowledge may not have vanished through annihilation alone. It may have dissolved because its carriers changed too many times. Oral tradition enters ritual. Ritual enters elite custody. Elite custody enters partial writing. Writing is copied by descendants who preserve the surface while quietly losing parts of the code. Then political collapse, migration, conquest, or religious reform breaks the chain again. At the end of that sequence, one may still have monuments, signs, myths, orientations to the stars, inherited taboo zones, sacred numbers, recurring animals, recurring hand positions, recurring geometric forms, yet no full sentence remains to explain why they once belonged together. This is where unreadability begins to resemble burial. A text does not need to be covered in earth to disappear. It needs only to remain untranslatable for long enough that later cultures grow around it like roots around stone. The object stays visible, the meaning sinks below the line of ordinary access. One generation speculates, another mythologizes, another dismisses, another turns the unread sign into an emblem, a brand, a curiosity. Meanwhile, the original intention continues to recede. What was once precise becomes atmospheric. What was once instruction becomes ornament. What was once law becomes mystery. And perhaps this is why so many ancient symbols seem to radiate a peculiar emotional force even when their definitions are uncertain. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to the difference between randomness and intention. An undeciphered sign system can still be felt as purposeful, ordered, and charged with significance, even when it remains opaque. One does not understand it, but one recognizes that it once belonged to understanding. That recognition creates an almost sacred frustration. It is like hearing the rhythm of a language through a wall without being able to separate the words. If the first civilization disappeared through layers of environmental loss, selective preservation, and institutional control, then unreadability may have been its final veil. Not because later people wished ignorance upon themselves, but because continuity is more delicate than it appears. All it takes is one broken chain at the wrong moment, one school of readers extinguished, one priesthood displaced, one archive abandoned, one migration that carries the ritual but leaves the lexicon. After enough such breaks, descendants may continue living among inherited forms while no longer possessing the master key. There is a severe philosophical weight in that possibility. Modern civilization often imagines knowledge as cumulative, as though once discovered it enters a permanent treasury, but the past suggests otherwise. Knowledge survives only through transmission, and transmission depends on bodies, institutions, habits, memory, and trust. Remove enough of those, and even a sophisticated symbolic world can vanish into visibility. It does not become non-existent. It becomes unreadable, which may, in practical terms, be worse. A destroyed message at least admits its loss. An unread message tempts every age to speak over it. And that, perhaps, is what later civilizations have done repeatedly. Where they could not read, they interpreted. Where they could not interpret, they sanctified. Where they could neither sanctify nor use, they ignored. The silence of the first civilization may therefore be crowded with mistaken translations, inherited misreadings, and symbols whose afterlives have little resemblance to their first meanings. One world speaks, another hears only echo. A third builds doctrine around the echo and calls the matter settled. So the buried beginning draws nearer in an unexpected way. It may not be hiding only in distant ruins or under drowned coastlines. It may also be hidden inside the very traditions that claim to inherit it, preserved as form while emptied of language. And once that thought takes hold, another question begins to move beneath it. If the earliest human world survived partly as unread signs, then who, in the ages that followed, gained the power to decide what those signs were allowed to mean? Because the moment meaning is reassigned, the past is not only forgotten, it is governed. The moment meaning is reassigned, the past is no longer merely remembered, it is administered. That is when memory passes from the uncertain custody of survivors into the structured custody of institutions, and institutions, for all the shelter they provide, have never been simple guardians. They preserve by selecting, they protect by narrowing, they transmit by translation, and every translation carries a quiet violence inside it, because no world can be carried whole into another without something being trimmed away. If the earliest civilization survived as fragments, symbols, rituals, myths, alignments, sacred sites, and broken inheritances, then the question becomes sharper now. Who inherited the right to explain those remnants? And once they did, how much of the first world was preserved, only after being made obedient to the needs of the next one? Priests understood early what rulers also learned. Memory is power when it can be organized. A people may survive hunger, migration, even conquest, and still remain dangerous to a new order if they carry an older map of meaning inside them. But once the stories of origin, the names of gods, the laws of kinship, the sacred calendar, and the interpretation of symbols are centralized, something changes. The invisible architecture of the world is no longer distributed across the entire culture in the same way. It begins to pass through appointed mouths, through temple courtyards, through scribal schools, through dynastic ceremonies, through approved texts copied and recopied until their arrangement begins to feel inevitable. This is one of the oldest paradoxes in civilization. Without temples, archives, and trained custodians, enormous amounts of knowledge would have vanished. Songs fade, oral chains break, local customs disappear with famine, war, or displacement. Institutions preserve against that erosion. Yet institutions also compress. They do not merely keep memory alive, they standardize it. They decide which version will be called authentic, which variant will be ignored, which ritual will be elevated, which local god will be folded into a larger system, which ancient site will be reinterpreted so that it serves the present rather than disturbing it. The process is rarely announced as erasure. It comes dressed as order. A shrine becomes part of a state cult. A mountain spirit becomes an aspect of a greater deity. A seasonal rite is absorbed into an official calendar. A founding myth is rewritten so that a ruling line appears chosen from the beginning. The older material survives, but under supervision. Its raw edges are softened. Its contradictions are managed. Its dangerous pluralities are reduced. What began as a wild inheritance becomes a disciplined one. That is why later religious and imperial systems should not be imagined only as destroyers. Often they were curators of the ancient world. But curation is never innocent. A curated past is a past arranged for use. Even reverence can become a mask for control. A sacred object placed in a temple treasury is protected from decay, but it is also removed from ordinary hands. A myth written into canonical form is saved from total loss, but alternate tellings begin to die. A ritual fixed by priestly rule becomes repeatable across generations, yet its living flexibility disappears. The body survives, the motion stiffens, meaning remains, but within boundaries set by authority. In such a world, the first civilization does not need to be denied openly in order to be erased. It need only be inherited through systems that have reasons to simplify it. A later empire does not benefit from admitting that the sacred landscape it rules was once shaped by forgotten peoples whose claims, gods, or cosmology do not align neatly with its own legitimacy. A priestly order does not necessarily wish to emphasize that the symbols it now interprets may descend from a much older and less centralized world. The very stability of institutions often depends on appearing foundational. To acknowledge too much before oneself is to loosen the aura of being first, chosen, or divinely anchored. This is why official memory has always contained a hidden threshold. It welcomes the past, but only after asking it to enter in acceptable form. Whatever is too unruly, too ambiguous, too local, too ancient, or too incompatible with the new order is often left outside the gate. Some of it is condemned, some of it is absorbed, some of it is quietly forgotten. The result is not a simple lie. It is something more enduring, a usable ancestry. And usable ancestry is one of civilization's most elegant inventions because it allows a society to inherit depth without inheriting too much disorder. The listener may begin to notice how this repeats across ages. Temples built atop earlier sanctuaries, holy places rededicated under new names, sacred dates aligned with older festivals, indigenous cosmologies folded into imperial religion, philosophical systems reinterpreting myths that were once tied to very different ritual worlds. Even when nothing is smashed, replacement takes place. A later order stands in continuity with an earlier one, but only after deciding how that continuity will be understood. That decision is itself an act of power. And power has always preferred beginnings that are singular, lawful, and legible. A scattered, plural, interrupted origin does not lend itself easily to centralized authority. It suggests that human order emerged in many places, perhaps with overlapping symbolic worlds, perhaps with knowledge diffused through roots later forgotten, perhaps with sacred forms older than any surviving dynasty. Such a beginning would be difficult to govern through. It would resist simple ownership, much easier then to draw a cleaner line, to say, here the world was founded properly, here kingship descended, here law began, here the true temple stood. Everything before this may be honoured, but only as prelude, yet preludes have a way of containing the real secret. What if the first civilization was reduced to prelude precisely because it could not be allowed to remain central? What if later systems inherited pieces of an older symbolic order and then built their own certainty by rearranging those pieces into a more manageable sequence? Not through theatrical conspiracy, but through the ordinary mechanics of sacred and political life. A copied text, a selected canon, a standardized ritual, a royal inscription claiming restoration rather than appropriation. Over centuries, these gestures would become indistinguishable from reality itself. Then comes the deeper injury. Once a version of the past has been sanctified, questioning it begins to feel like disorder. The archive speaks with authority. The temple speaks with authority. The empire speaks with authority. A different memory, especially one rooted in fragment, symbol, or local tradition, begins to appear weak by comparison. It survives only in half-light, in folk tales, in obscure rites, in architectural anomalies, in names whose meanings are no longer clear, in symbols repeated by habit rather than comprehension. The older world is not entirely gone. It is merely no longer authorized to explain itself. This may be the quiet genius of civilizational replacement. It does not always need fire. It can achieve almost everything through interpretation. Once the right to define meaning is monopolized, even surviving evidence can be made to serve new narratives. A carved figure is no longer what it was. It becomes what the current priesthood says it represents. A mound is no longer the center of an older sacred geography. It becomes the foundation of a newer holiness. A flood myth is no longer memory of rupture. It becomes proof of a moral order the present regime claims to uphold. The remnants remain visible, but their voice has been ventriloquized, and perhaps that is what makes the first civilization so difficult to recover. Its traces may survive not only in ruins or drowned plains, but inside traditions that absorb them too successfully. The old meanings were not always destroyed. They were rerouted, redirected into liturgies, laws, and cosmologies that preserved the shell while changing the center. By the time later generations inherited these forms, the transition had already hardened into normality. This leaves behind an image almost more unsettling than total loss. Not a vanished world swallowed whole, but an ancient civilization gradually speaking through other mouths, in other languages, under other authorities, until no one could separate the original voice from the later chorus built upon it. A sacred inheritance still present but disciplined, still visible but domesticated, still powerful but no longer free to name itself. And once that possibility is allowed into the room, another question rises almost immediately. If priesthoods, empires, and systems of authorized knowledge became the interpreters of the earliest fragments, what happened to everything that resisted interpretation? The awkward ruins, the anomalous artifacts, the sites that did not fit the approved story, the memories too old, too local, too contradictory to be safely absorbed. Those remnants may not have vanished by accident. They may have been pushed into the margins where civilization stores what it cannot entirely destroy and cannot comfortably explain. Civilization has always known what to do with what it cannot comfortably explain. It moves it outward. Not always into oblivion, because oblivion is difficult to manage. More often into the margins, where awkward things can remain visible without becoming authoritative. The ruin that does not fit the accepted chronology is labelled unusual. The artifact whose craftsmanship appears out of place is isolated from larger implication. The local tradition that preserves an inconvenient memory is recast as folklore. The sacred place older than the official temple is acknowledged, but only as a primitive precursor, a shadow awaiting fulfillment in the system that came later. In this way, the past is not simply remembered or erased, it is ranked. Some fragments are allowed near the center, others are kept at a safe distance, where they may intrigue, but not disturb. That is where the mystery of the first civilization begins to change its shape again. Until now, the silence has seemed like absence. Drowned coasts, buried sanctuaries, broken scripts, curated kingship, priestly interpretation. But another possibility begins to emerge through those layers. Perhaps the earliest complex human world did not disappear into nothingness at all. Perhaps it survived in broken distribution, scattered across later cultures, in ways that made it difficult for any single civilization to claim openly. If so, then the problem is not only that the origin was lost, the problem is that what survived was too dispersed, too plural, and too contradictory to fit the later appetite for a singular beginning. Human beings love firsts, the first city, the first temple, the first writing, the first kingdom, the first law. Such language gives history a clean line, a ceremonial entrance. Yet real cultural formation rarely moves like that. It accumulates in pockets, exchanges across distances, disappears in one place while reappearing in another, carries techniques without carrying names, preserves symbols after forgetting their first context. The earliest civilization may therefore have been less like a throne and more like weather, spread across regions, altering landscapes, binding groups together, through ritual, exchange, astronomy, myth, and seasonal coordination, without necessarily producing the sharp political forms later historians prefer to recognize. This is difficult for official memory to tolerate. A plural origin creates problems for authority. If the first sacred knowledge belonged to many places, if early monumental behaviour emerged in multiple cultural zones, if no single centre can honestly claim to have invented the human passage into organised symbolic life, then later systems lose the comfort of ancestral exclusivity. The neat story of descent weakens. The right to speak as the chosen inheritor of origins becomes harder to defend, and so complexity is reduced. Many beginnings are narrowed into one line. One line becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes tradition. Tradition, repeated long enough, becomes common sense. Archaeology itself, despite its rigour, has not been immune to this longing for clean beginnings. Entire generations were trained to think in thresholds. Agriculture first, then villages, then cities, then writing, then the state. There is truth in those patterns, but the earth keeps complicating them. Monumental ritual appears earlier than expected. Long-distance exchange appears in contexts once thought too simple to sustain it. Symbolic systems appear before the political forms assume to support them. In some places, large communal architecture precedes dense urbanism. In others, social complexity does not move toward statehood in the expected manner at all. The old staircase of progress remains useful, but it no longer feels as complete as it once did. Some of the steps were perhaps laid sideways. That is why the idea of a first civilization now feels unstable in a deeper sense. The phrase may refer not to an original historical reality, but to a later act of compression. It may be the result of retrospective ordering imposed on a far messier human dawn. The listener can almost sense the difference. On one side stands the official image. A people rises, discovers the necessary tools of civilization, names the gods, orders labour, invents record, and becomes the beginning. On the other side stands a less comfortable possibility. Humanity crossed into civilization in overlapping waves, through networks of ritual and adaptation so distributed that no later state could inherit the whole truth of it. In that second picture, later civilizations were not wrong to call themselves heirs. They were wrong only in imagining that the inheritance had ever belonged to one house alone. That might explain why certain anomalies continue to trouble the margins of history, without ever fully entering the centre, the deep antiquity of some ritual landscapes. The recurrence of cosmological symbols in distant regions, the uneven emergence of monumental behaviour, the persistence of flood memories, culture-bringer myths, sacred mountains, hidden teachers, vanished ages, and ruined centres whose builders seem older than the narratives attached to them. None of these by itself proves a lost global civilization, and it would be careless to pretend otherwise. But together they create pressure against a simplified origin. They suggest that early human organisation may have been richer and more interconnected in symbolic terms than later political boundaries can easily represent. Once that possibility is admitted, the act of marginalization becomes easier to recognize. A fragment survives, but only as curiosity. A parallel tradition survives, but only as legend. A regional cosmology survives, but only after being subordinated to imperial theology. A pre-state sacred landscape survives, but only when described as a prelude to real civilization. Again and again, the same motion appears. What does not fit the authorized line is not always destroyed, because destruction would draw attention. It is simply repositioned, quietly made secondary, made ancient in the wrong way, made impressive perhaps, but safely disconnected from the right to redefine the beginning. There is an almost philosophical cruelty in that. The margins preserve what the centre cannot digest. But preservation in the margins comes at a cost. Once separated from official continuity, a memory loses force. It may survive among local communities, in obscure texts, in contested archaeological reports, in ceremonial fragments, in strange alignments no one fully explains, in stories scholars classify as myth while never fully accounting for their persistence. These remnants become easier to doubt precisely because they no longer speak from power. Yet perhaps that is what makes them valuable. They have not been smoothed into comfort. They still carry splinters. The first civilization, then, may not have erased itself in a single act. It may have dissolved into later worlds so unevenly that no one inherited enough of it to recognize the whole. What one culture called its oldest temple may have been only one surviving chamber of a larger symbolic geography. What another called divine revelation may have contained reworked memory from a much older cosmology. What a third, treated as sacred lore, may have rested on practical and ritual inheritances whose true age had already been forgotten. The origin did not vanish completely. It was distributed beyond recognition, and once distributed it became vulnerable to ranking. Some inheritances were elevated because they supported power. Others were tolerated because they entertained, ornamented or dignified a local past. Others still were pushed toward irrelevance because they implied a deeper antiquity than the present order wished to acknowledge. Thus the centre of history remained stable while the margins accumulated unresolved things, those old, persistent pieces that never stop returning, not as answers, but as pressure. Pressure is perhaps the most honest word for what they exert. Not proof, not certainty. Pressure against narrowness. Pressure against the idea that civilization began once, in one orderly burst, under one officially named sky. Pressure against the comfort of a simple dawn. And in that pressure, another unsettling thought begins to emerge. If the earliest human world was fragmented and then forced into the margins of later memory, perhaps the true archive of the first civilization does not lie in any single ruin, scripture, or drowned shelf. Perhaps it lies in the pattern formed by all the things official history has repeatedly treated as secondary. That thought changes the listener's relationship to the evidence. The margin is no longer where weak material goes to die. It becomes the place where excluded continuity lingers, and if that is true, the question that follows is difficult to avoid. Who created those margins in the first place? Not nature this time, not flood, not cold, not sediment. Human systems did that. They established centres, and in doing so they taught later ages where to look, and more importantly where not to look. Which means the next layer of the mystery may not concern what the first civilization built, but how later knowledge itself was arranged to keep certain inheritances peripheral. Because once a society learns to sort truth by institutional convenience, forgetting becomes more than a consequence. It becomes a method. Forgetting becomes a method long before it becomes a theme. It settles into the structure of knowledge itself, into the habits by which a civilization decides what counts as serious, what counts as peripheral, what deserves preservation, and what may remain outside the official field of vision. Once that process begins, it no longer needs open censorship to be effective. A culture does not have to burn every troubling fragment if it can simply train its scholars, priests and rulers to look past it. It does not have to deny every older inheritance if it can assign those inheritances to the wrong category. Myth instead of memory, ritual instead of observation, symbol instead of knowledge. That may be the more refined form of erasure. Not destruction, but classification. This becomes especially unsettling when the gaze turns upward. The sky was the first great archive that no empire could fully own. Before walls, before writing, before dynastic inscriptions and fixed canons, there was the regularity of stars, the return of solstices, the slow drift of seasons, the moon dividing darkness into countable parts. Any human community attentive enough to survive through migration, planting, hunting, or ceremony would eventually have learned that the heavens were not decoration. They were order itself. The sky did not merely inspire religion, it taught measure, recurrence, anticipation, orientation. It gave pattern to time before time was written. This raises a quiet but important question. If early societies were already reading the sky with care, and if some of the first ritual landscapes were aligned with celestial events, then later ages may have inherited not primitive superstition, but fragments of observational worlds whose original sophistication was gradually misunderstood. Modern people, standing at a distance, often divide knowledge into neat compartments. Astronomy on one side, religion on the other, mathematics in one chamber, myth in another. But the earliest civilizations did not necessarily think in those separations. A star could be a deity, a calendar marker, a navigational anchor, and a sign within a larger cosmological order all at once. To call such a system merely mythic is to risk mishearing it completely. There is something poignant in the survival of ancient alignments. A structure faces the solstice sunrise, a temple axis follows lunar rhythm, a passage frames a particular star. A ceremonial enclosure seems to respond not only to the land around it, but to recurring events above it. These patterns have been identified in different forms across regions and eras, from megalithic landscapes to temple complexes, to city plans shaped by sacred geometry and celestial correspondence. No single example proves a hidden master tradition. That would be too easy, and the past is rarely that obliging. Yet the recurring presence of such alignments suggests a world in which observation and meaning were deeply fused. The sky was not only watched, it was interpreted as structure. This matters because structures of interpretation can survive long after the conceptual language behind them has thinned. A later people may preserve an orientation without fully preserving the reasons for it. A ritual date may continue to be observed after the astronomical logic beneath it has become secondary to theology or custom. A sacred number may be repeated without memory of the original cycles it tracked. In such cases, knowledge does not vanish all at once. It hardens into liturgy. It moves from discovery to inheritance, from active reading of the heavens to repetition of a pattern, once derived from that reading. The shell remains accurate, or partly accurate, but its source grows dim. This is one way a civilization can lose its own intelligence without losing all of its forms. The first builders may have encoded practical, sacred, and cosmological understanding into architecture, orientation, procession, and symbol. Later generations, inheriting those forms through broken continuity, may still reproduce them, but within altered frameworks of meaning. Eventually the original integration is forgotten, and what once united science, ritual, and metaphysics becomes divided by the categories of a later age. The ancestors become pious but supposedly naive. Their structures become sacred but not necessarily learned. Their myths become poetic but not observational. In this way, a deep order can remain visible while being intellectually downgraded by those who inherit it. There is no need to exaggerate this into fantasies of impossible lost technology. The older and subtler possibility is powerful enough. A pre-literate or early literate civilization may have developed sophisticated sky knowledge embedded in communal life rather than isolated in specialized scientific discourse. Such knowledge would be vulnerable in a particular way. If the social fabric carrying it were disrupted by flood, migration, conquest, priestly centralization, script loss, or theological reform, the visible traces might survive while their full explanatory matrix did not. A later culture might know that a place is sacred at dawn on a certain day, yet no longer know why the ancestors first marked that dawn with such care. Then classification begins its work. Modern scholarship, when overly rigid, may look at an ancient structure aligned to celestial events and treat the alignment as interesting but secondary, an embellishment rather than a key. Religious tradition may absorb the alignment into symbolic language and preserve the observance without the older cosmological texture. Empires may adopt the sacred site, rededicate it, and fold its celestial logic into new legitimating myths. Across time, the result is similar. The evidence remains, but its intellectual dignity changes. The ancestors are allowed devotion, but not always precision. They are granted awe, but not always disciplined observation. And yet the stones resist this reduction in their own quiet way. Orientation is stubborn. Repeated correspondences are stubborn. The marriage of monument and sky keeps pressing against simple narratives of human development. It suggests that early civilizations, or pre-civilizational ritual cultures on the threshold of later complexity, may have inhabited a more integrated mode of knowing than later categories easily permit. They did not separate the world into the modern compartments of science, religion, politics, and symbolism, because the world itself had not yet been broken that way in their imagination. A temple could be observatory, calendar, map of the cosmos, theatre of power, and site of mourning all at once. This integrated vision may help explain why the first civilization is so difficult to recover. What was lost was not merely a set of facts. It may have been an entire way of joining facts to meaning. Later ages inherit the observable residue, the alignments, the symbols, the recurring sacred dates, but not the internal unity that once made those things intelligible. Then, because the unity is gone, interpreters choose one surviving layer and elevate it above the others. The site becomes religious rather than astronomical, or astronomical rather than ritual, or political rather than sacred. Each label clarifies something while concealing the older whole. That concealment can happen even without ill will. It is built into the limitations of inherited frameworks. Still, power benefits from it. A world whose oldest monuments encode a sophisticated fusion of observation and sacred order is harder to patronize, harder to place neatly beneath later authority. Far easier to imagine the first civilizations as spiritually intense but intellectually partial, waiting for more advanced ages to separate truth from myth. Such a view flatters the present. It also narrows the past, and perhaps that narrowing is one more form of erasure. Not the wiping away of evidence, but the stripping away of its full seriousness. The first civilization may remain before the human eye in stone, axis, horizon line, and recurring date, yet still be misunderstood because later systems train themselves to read only one dimension at a time. What survives looks mysterious, not because it is irrational, but because the interpretive language surrounding it has been fragmented. So the sky enters the mystery not as decoration but as witness. It watched the first builders. It kept their cycles even after their names dissolved. It remained above every flood, every migration, every priesthood, every empire that claimed to speak for beginnings. And perhaps that is why the oldest monuments continue to disturb the certainty of later ages. They appear to remember a conversation between earth and heaven, whose grammar has not entirely vanished, only broken. Which leaves the mind with a quieter and more difficult question. If the first civilization encoded parts of its deepest understanding into stone, season, and celestial rhythm, and if later societies inherited those forms while losing the language that once joined them together, then what else in the ancient world has been dismissed as mere symbolism simply because modern memory no longer knows how to read intelligence when it is wrapped in the sacred? And beyond that, who benefited most from teaching generations to make that mistake? Who benefited most from teaching generations to mistake intelligence, wrapped in the sacred, for mere symbolism? The answer does not belong to one empire, one priesthood, or one century. It belongs to a recurring impulse in civilization itself, the urge to inherit the prestige of the ancient world without inheriting all of its unsettling implications. Once a later order stands upon older ground, it faces a choice. It can acknowledge the depth beneath its feet and risk appearing secondary, derivative, or incomplete. Or it can absorb that depth selectively, claiming continuity where useful and minimizing whatever threatens the clarity of its own authority. Most civilizations, when given that choice, have shown a patient preference for the second path. This is not always done through outright destruction, though history has no shortage of that as well. Temples have been looted, statues beheaded, libraries burned, inscriptions broken, sacred groves cut down, and old gods publicly humiliated, so that new ones may stand where they once stood. Yet the more durable injury is often quieter. A monument is not demolished, it is repurposed. A sanctuary is not denied, it is rededicated. A sacred hill becomes the foundation of a later holy centre. An older myth is reinterpreted until it now points toward the legitimacy of a new ruling order. The original structure remains visible, but its voice is rerouted. In this way, civilizational replacement often resembles translation more than annihilation. But translation, when controlled by power, can become one of history's most elegant forms of conquest. The earth is full of layered holy places for precisely this reason. Human beings return to certain landscapes again and again because those places exert force. Springs, heights, caves, crossroads, river bends, mountain ridges, old enclosures aligned with the sky. A later people rarely discover such a place and treats it as neutral. More often, they recognize its charge, whether consciously or instinctively, and place their own sacred order upon it. To build there is to claim not only space but depth. It allows the new system to appear rooted in time rather than merely present within it. Yet each new layer changes the meaning of the older one. The site survives. The interpretive centre shifts. This is one reason ancient ruins are so often found cannibalized by later societies. Stones are reused, foundations are built over, columns are carried off to support new monuments. The gesture can be practical, but it is never merely practical. To incorporate the material remains of an older world into the architecture of a new one is to perform a kind of historical digestion. The past is not left to speak independently. It is made to uphold the present, literally and symbolically. A broken temple in the countryside is one thing. A broken temple reborn inside the capital of its successor is another. There, the older civilization continues only as raw material, and raw material is easier to govern than living memory. A living tradition can argue, resist, or carry alternative authority. Stones cannot. Once the sacred centre of an earlier world has been dismantled and redistributed, the old system loses coherence. Its artifacts remain, but not its sovereignty. This pattern appears across empires and religions with such consistency that it begins to look less like accident and more like instinct. New orders rise by consuming the visible remains of what came before them. Even when reverence is present, control is never far behind. The politics of ruin, then, are not merely about destruction. They are about who gets to stand closest to the remains and define what they mean. An empire may restore an older monument and inscribe its own name upon the restoration. A ruler may claim to be reviving a forgotten cult while quietly altering it beyond recognition. A priesthood may preserve a sacred calendar while aligning its observances to a new theology. A conquering religion may condemn local practice in public while privately absorbing its sites, symbols and festivals into a transformed system of worship. All of this produces a strange historical effect. The older world survives, but mostly as evidence for the grandeur, tolerance, or inevitability of the order that replaced it. That should make the listener cautious whenever history presents continuity too smoothly. Continuity may be real, but real continuity is often jagged. It carries friction, contradiction, and visible seams. When those seams disappear too neatly, one suspects that the rougher parts have been planned away. The first civilization, if its remains were gradually appropriated by later powers, may now be visible only through those later surfaces. One sees the temple, but not the original shrine beneath it. One sees the law, but not the buried ritual logic from which parts of it may descend. One sees the sacred feast, but not the older seasonal cosmology it displaced and quietly inherited. There is also a subtler form of seizure that operates not through stone but through prestige. Later civilizations often claim the ancient world by narrating themselves as its rightful culmination. They do not merely preserve what came before, they complete it. The older culture is honoured, but only as preparation for a higher revelation, a stronger empire, a more universal law, a more disciplined theology. This move is extraordinarily powerful because it allows a new order to inherit the legitimacy of antiquity, while simultaneously placing antiquity beneath itself. The past is praised and subordinated in a single gesture. What survives of the old world survives only on the condition that it point beyond itself. In such a framework, truly independent antiquity becomes difficult to tolerate. An earlier civilization that appears too sophisticated, too symbolically coherent, too scientifically attentive, or too spiritually self-sufficient threatens the narrative of culmination. Better, then, to interpret it as incomplete, to admire its grandeur while quietly assuming its immaturity, to preserve its art while minimizing its thought, to study its symbols while assuming that their highest meaning could only be fulfilled later, elsewhere, under another authority. This habit does not always feel violent. Often it feels educational, respectful, even pious. Yet it has the same long-term result as cruder methods. The original civilization loses the right to define itself. This may explain why certain archaeological anomalies provoke such discomfort. A monument older than expected. A symbolic system whose sophistication resists the timeline assigned to it. A ritual landscape that implies coordination without the bureaucratic state forms historians once assumed were necessary. Such evidence creates pressure not only on chronology, but on ownership. If intelligence, organization, and cosmological seriousness were present earlier and more widely than official narratives prefer, then later claims to singular inheritance weaken. The past becomes less linear, less obedient, less easy to rank, and wherever ranking is threatened, institutions tend to defend themselves. Defense can take many forms. Sometimes it is open dismissal. Sometimes it is the narrowing language of scholarship itself, interesting, suggestive, but inconclusive, ritual rather than technical, symbolic rather than precise. Sometimes it is public fascination without structural reconsideration. The anomaly is displayed, discussed, admired, and then carefully prevented from changing the larger architecture of accepted history. This too is a politics of ruin. The fragment is allowed to exist, but not to govern interpretation. The first civilization may therefore have been erased not because every remnant was destroyed, but because every remnant that survived was eventually forced to serve another framework. Nature broke the body. Later, powers rearranged the bones. What remained was neither pure falsehood nor whole truth, but a curated inheritance, a sacred landscape redistributed, a symbolic language translated through systems that needed ancestry, but not too much ambiguity. A memory preserved under terms set by those who came after. And perhaps that is the deepest unease of all. Human civilization may not simply forget the worlds it builds upon. It may require their partial obscurity in order to remain psychologically stable. To admit that the present stands on buried orders it no longer fully understands is to weaken the illusion of clean beginnings. It is to confess dependence on ruins whose original builders may have known things, organised life in ways, or faced catastrophes that later ages still struggle to comprehend. That confession is rarely convenient. So the ruins remain, sometimes shattered, sometimes rededicated, sometimes polished into harmless heritage, sometimes left just enigmatic enough to fascinate without destabilising anything important. But ruins, even when governed, have a way of refusing full obedience. They hold their own silence too well, and in that silence another question begins to gather. If later civilizations repeatedly dismantled, repurposed, and narrated over the remains of older worlds, then perhaps the most honest witnesses were never the monumental centres at all. Perhaps the deeper truth of the first civilization survived not in the stones most visibly seized by power, but in the smaller traces power overlooked. The seeds, the bones, the water channels, the ordinary things too humble to be worth rewriting. The grand monuments are usually the first things power learns to seize. Temples can be rededicated, palaces can be stripped for stone, statues can be broken, renamed, or made to kneel beneath newer symbols. But the smaller remains of a civilization are more difficult to command. They do not lend themselves easily to ceremony. A seed husk in ancient soil does not flatter an empire. A line of sediment trapped in a forgotten canal does not make a ruler appear chosen. Burn marks on animal bone, traces of pollen, fragments of plaster, the angle of a drain, the chemistry of a buried floor. These things do not speak in the language of legitimacy. They speak in another register altogether, quieter and less obedient. And it may be that the deepest truth about the first civilization survived there, not in the monuments later ages learned to control, but in the humble residues no one thought important enough to rewrite. There is something strangely intimate about such evidence. Monumental history presents itself like theatre. It announces conquest, devotion, law, kingship, eternity. Ordinary remains do something else. They force the listener close to breath, labour, weather, and repetition. Charred grain in an ancient hearth says more than abundance. It says that hands were present, that a season turned, that hunger or planning, ritual or routine, shaped the moment. Animal bones bearing butchery marks do not merely prove diet. They reveal habit, preference, ecological adaptation, scarcity, perhaps feast. A drainage system beneath a settlement tells of rain remembered and controlled, of seasonal intelligence, of people not simply surviving in landscape but entering into repeated negotiation with it. This kind of testimony rarely makes grand claims, and that is precisely why it matters. It is much harder to bend ordinary evidence toward mythic self-importance. A royal inscription can exaggerate, a genealogy can be arranged, a temple can be made to serve a new theology. But a seed tells only what the earth allowed it to preserve. A pollen record tells what grew, when it grew, and sometimes when it stopped. Microscopic residues from ceramic vessels can reveal what was cooked, stored, fermented, or carried. In these details, civilizations lose their ceremonial masks. They become patterns of life, and patterns of life are often more revealing than official memory, because they cannot so easily lie about continuity. This is where the question of the first civilization becomes unexpectedly tender. What if the true evidence of that earliest world was never hidden primarily in its kings, temples, or myths? What if it persisted instead in infrastructures of care too ordinary to attract ideological control? Irrigation channels, food remains, textile impressions, quarry scars, burial positioning, animal domestication patterns, traces of medicinal plants, residues of pigments, worn thresholds showing repeated movement across a space. Such things do not declare themselves as sacred revelation, yet taken together, they reveal something deeper than spectacle. They reveal a civilization's habits of attention, what it valued enough to repeat, what it feared enough to prepare for, what rhythms shaped its days and nights. And perhaps that is why these humble remains so often complicate official narratives. Great systems like clarity, they prefer broad stories, kings founded, gods decreed, rivers blessed, enemies defeated, laws bestowed. But the archaeology of ordinary life reveals complexity where doctrine prefers simplicity. It shows trade where isolation was assumed, ritual mingling with practical life where neat categories had been imposed, unexpected continuity beneath supposed breaks, or abrupt change beneath confident claims of stability. Sometimes the smallest fragments quietly expose the arrogance of the larger story. A civilization trying to erase or overwrite what came before may succeed at seizing monuments, but it cannot fully erase the ecological and domestic signatures left in ground. Later powers may build over old foundations, yet the soil beneath remembers cultivation shifts, abandonment phases, contamination, drought, flood, and fire. They may rename a sacred place, yet beneath the renamed sanctuary lie animal remains from earlier ritual systems, older pigments, earlier alignments, discarded tools, altered species distributions, evidence of feasting, evidence of migration, evidence that the place meant something long before the accepted story began. The earth is not neutral, but neither is it easily persuaded to flatter power. There is an almost moral quality to that kind of evidence. It restores scale. It reminds the listener that civilizations are not only systems of authority, but also accumulations of countless ordinary decisions made by people whose names no inscription preserved. When official memory narrows the past into dynasties and monuments, it often forgets that continuity actually lives in households, in water use, in seed selection, in inherited craftsmanship, in burial gestures repeated over generations. If the first civilization vanished, then its disappearance must have been lived first by ordinary people, not by abstractions, by bodies losing access to familiar rivers, by artisans repeating symbols whose original cosmology had begun to blur, by communities altering diets, routes, and rituals under pressure from climate, migration, or domination. This is where the smallest traces become almost more haunting than the grandest ruins. They do not allow the comfort of distance. A monumental site can be admired aesthetically. A pollen shift suggesting sudden environmental disruption, or a change in faunal assemblage indicating altered subsistence patterns, or traces of abandoned irrigation, or evidence that one local material suddenly replaced another. These things force the story downward into lived rupture. The first civilization, whatever it was, did not disappear as an idea. It disappeared as a way of cooking, planting, honouring the dead, managing water, reading season, moving through architecture, listening to landscape. And because such evidence is humble, it often survives outside the zones most heavily scripted by later meaning. An empire may seize a temple, it does not usually seize discarded fish bones. A priesthood may formalize a sacred feast. It does not fully control the residue trapped in cooking vessels beneath older layers. A dynasty may proclaim itself heir to ancient order. It cannot rewrite tree rings, flood deposits, phytoliths, or the wear pattern on a threshold stone that proves generations entered a place differently before the dynasty's story began. The ordinary world leaves marks with no concern for legitimacy. That makes it one of the most stubborn witnesses the past possesses. Still, these witnesses are easy to overlook, precisely because they lack spectacle. Public imagination tends to gather around mystery when mystery is monumental. Buried chambers, lost cities, giant stones. But a civilization can be more fully recovered from waste than from triumph. Refuse reveals diet, trade, seasonality, health, hierarchy, adaptation. The debris of daily life can show whether continuity truly held, or whether the social world beneath official rhetoric was already changing beyond recognition. If the first civilization was gradually erased, then the process may be clearest not where rulers spoke, but where ordinary life shifted in silence. That is a difficult thought for any later system built on sacred origins, because it suggests that truth does not always reside where authority points. The official archive may preserve names, but the soil preserves consequences. The temple may preserve doctrine, but the canal preserves dependence. The monument may preserve ideal form, but the kitchen preserves reality. And reality is often less tidy than the stories built to govern it. Perhaps that is why the deeper past keeps escaping the grasp of final explanation. Every time the story begins to harden around monuments and kings, another layer of ordinary evidence interrupts. A buried house plan complicates the sacred topography. A changing crop pattern complicates the image of uninterrupted prosperity. A set of modest graves complicates the official lineage. The first civilization begins to appear less as a single shining centre, and more as a web of ordinary continuities repeatedly stressed, broken, adapted, and partially inherited. And in that web, another possibility begins to stir. If the humble residues of life preserve truths that monumental history could not fully control, then perhaps myth itself should be re-examined in the same spirit. Not as royal proclamation, not as theology alone, but as another form of ordinary continuity, compressed, distorted, and carried by human communities even when institutions rearranged everything else. Which raises the next question almost softly. If the small remains of daily life can outlast official memory, then could the same be true of stories? Could myth, dismissed so often as ornament or fantasy, have preserved fragments of the first civilization in a form subtle enough to survive even after history itself was rewritten? Could myth have preserved fragments of the first civilization in a form subtle enough to survive even after history itself was rewritten? The possibility is easy to mock when myth is approached carelessly, as though every ancient story were either literal fact or decorative fiction. But myth has never lived comfortably inside that narrow division. It is too dense for mere ornament, too fluid for simple reportage. It carries memory in symbolic compression. It preserves trauma by giving it shape. It carries old structures of meaning across generations that may no longer possess the language, geography, or institutions that first gave those structures coherence. And because of that, myth may be one of the last shelters available to a civilization once its official continuity is broken. There is a reason the oldest stories so often begin after something has already been lost. A flood has passed. A golden age has ended. A city has fallen. The gods have withdrawn. Humanity has become diminished, forgetful, estranged from a former order. Again and again, ancient traditions look backward not toward a neat beginning, but toward a rupture between an older world and the one now being endured. This pattern appears across cultures too frequently to be dismissed as mere coincidence of imagination. It may not point to one single event, but it does suggest a deep human habit of remembering origins through damage rather than through clarity. The first civilization, if it faded through catastrophe, reinterpretation and controlled memory, would likely remain visible in just such a form. Not as archive, but as wound translated into story. One begins to notice how many myths revolve around bringers of order arriving after disorder or returning after loss. Culture heroes, divine lawgivers, surviving ancestors, wise strangers from beyond the sea, sacred teachers emerging after the flood, bearers of writing, agriculture, measurement, astronomy, temple forms, or burial lore. Such figures appear in very different traditions wearing different names and theological meanings. It would be careless to flatten them into a single source, yet it would be equally careless to ignore the recurring structure. Why does so much of ancient memory imagine civilization not as a spontaneous invention, but as a recovery? Why do so many peoples place knowledge in the hands of survivors, mediators, or restorers rather than simple founders? perhaps because what they inherited did not feel entirely new. It felt carried over from somewhere now unreachable. Myth excels at carrying the sensation of unreachable inheritance. It can preserve the emotional truth of fracture, even when the practical details have vanished. A drowned homeland becomes an age before the waters. A lost ritual complex becomes a mountain of the gods. The extinction of a line of teachers becomes a story of divine withdrawal. Broken transmission becomes taboo. Astronomical order becomes the journey of a solar deity or a celestial wheel. The story does not preserve everything, but it preserves enough for continuity of feeling. People may no longer know exactly what was lost, yet through myth they continue to know that something was lost, and that their present condition stands in relation to an older, more whole order. This gives myth a strange double character. It reveals and conceals at the same time. Because it is symbolic, it protects memory from being shattered completely by historical change. But because it is symbolic, it also hides the original referent beneath image, ritual, and repetition. A later priesthood can reinterpret it. A conquering empire can absorb it. A new theology can moralize it. A philosopher can allegorize it. A modern reader can dismiss it. Through all these changes, the story survives, yet its oldest layer recedes further. Myth becomes like a vessel passed from hand to hand, each age painting over the outside while something older still rests at the bottom. That may explain why comparative mythology remains both powerful and dangerous. It is powerful because recurring patterns across cultures can reveal shared concerns, catastrophe, sacred order, memory of prior ages, divine intermediaries, cyclical time, destruction followed by partial renewal. It is dangerous because similarity tempts exaggeration. Not every parallel points to contact. Not every motif preserves literal memory. Yet even with proper caution, the persistence of certain themes remains difficult to ignore. The flood survivor, the stolen fire, the law from the mountain, the city of the gods, the age of giants, sages or ancestors now gone, the knowledge once openly given and later hidden. These are not random decorations, they are recurring containers for civilizational anxiety. And perhaps anxiety is exactly what myth preserves best. Not data in the narrow modern sense, but pressure. The pressure of discontinuity, the pressure of feeling that present reality is thinner than what came before, the pressure of inheriting sacred forms whose origin lies beyond direct recall. If the first civilization dissolved gradually into later cultures, then myth may have functioned as one of the few means by which fragments of its memory could continue moving through populations even after formal institutions had transformed or collapsed. The official archive belongs to those in power. Myth can travel through ordinary people. It can survive in songs, rites, seasonal festivals, genealogies, domestic customs, local prohibitions and narratives told beside fire long after libraries have burned and temples have changed allegiance. This is why myth should not be treated as the opposite of history, but as one of history's shadow forms. It does not replace evidence. It does not free anyone from discipline. But it can indicate where pressure remains in collective memory even after the explanatory language has changed. A myth about a world destroyed by water does not prove a specific date or mechanism, but when such stories recur across regions deeply shaped by post-glacial or riverine instability, they begin to feel less like fantasy and more like cultural scar tissue. A tale of divine teachers civilizing humanity does not prove supernatural intervention, but it may preserve memory of knowledge arriving from older centres, from survivors, migrants, or elites who themselves inherited broken fragments of an earlier order. There is something almost merciful in this. Human beings do not always preserve what is true by preserving it clearly. Sometimes clarity is the first casualty of survival. After catastrophe, migration, conquest, or theological reorganization, communities may no longer be able to carry a precise account of the past. But they can carry a story that holds the outline of loss. They can carry symbols that insist the present is not the whole truth. They can carry names whose meanings are forgotten but whose gravity remains. In that sense, myth may be the language of memory after direct memory has become impossible. That thought should make the listener gentler with ancient stories, but not less discerning. Myth is not a hidden newspaper waiting to be decoded line by line. It is older and sadder than that. It is what remains when the world that first generated an event no longer survives intact enough to explain itself directly. It is memory surviving by changing shape. And because it changes shape, it survives regimes, floods, script loss, migrations, and cultural conquest better than many formal systems do. Perhaps that is why the earliest civilization still flickers in mythic form. Not because myths are childish attempts at explanation, but because they are among the most resilient forms through which damaged civilizations continue to speak. The first civilization may not have vanished entirely into stone, soil, or drowned coasts. Parts of it may still be alive in stories that later ages repeatedly domesticated without fully emptying. Stories of former ages, hidden knowledge, lost cities, sacred survivors, interrupted order, and the uneasy suspicion that humanity lives in the shadow of something it can no longer quite remember. And once myth is allowed back into the room as a serious witness, the final movements of the mystery begin to gather. Because if stories, ruins, and humble remains all point toward a past more fragmented and more ancient than official memory prefers, then the question is no longer only what was lost. The question becomes what the present needs in order to remain comfortable. Why do later civilizations repeatedly simplify their beginnings? Why do they bless the fragments that support them and neglect the ones that do not? Perhaps the first civilization was never erased completely. Perhaps every age since has participated, gently or forcefully, in keeping its deepest implications just beyond the edge of acceptable knowledge. Perhaps every age since has participated, gently or forcefully, in keeping the deepest implications of the first civilization just beyond the edge of acceptable knowledge. That possibility does not require a secret council whispering through the centuries. It requires something far more ordinary, and therefore far more powerful. The repeated human need for a stable beginning. Civilizations do not live by facts alone. They live by self-understanding. They need to believe that their laws emerged from an intelligible past, that their sacred order stands on a legitimate foundation, that their ancestors moved from darkness toward clarity in a sequence that can still be narrated without too much trembling. A fractured origin, a plural origin, a buried origin, or an origin inherited from ruins not fully understood. Such things are harder to live with. They weaken confidence. They disturb the ceremonial posture of the present. So every age simplifies, not always maliciously, often almost tenderly. It sands down the jagged edge of its own ancestry. It converts interruption into continuity, inheritance into invention, salvage into destiny. Where the record is broken, it supplies graceful transitions. Where symbols outlast explanation, it chooses explanations that flatter current institutions. Where ruins suggest an intelligence older than the accepted story, it places them into neat categories, gives them a manageable role, and prevents them from rearranging the wider architecture of belief. In this way, forgetting becomes not only a method of power, but a method of emotional survival. There is something deeply human in that. To inherit a world and discover that its foundations rest on layers of loss is a difficult burden. It means accepting that one's civilization may not be the clean flowering it imagined itself to be, but a latent partial arrangement built atop shattered continuities. It means acknowledging that sacred forms might predate the theology now wrapped around them, that legal structures may descend from older practical orders, that rituals of origin may actually be rituals of recovery. It means admitting that history at its root may be less like a ladder and more like a field of ruins from which each generation selects enough stone to build a habitable story. And perhaps that is what later civilizations could not bear openly. Not simply that there had been an earlier complexity, but that their own authority might depend on misunderstood inheritances. If the first civilization, or the earliest web of civilizational life, left behind fragments so foundational that later systems unconsciously built themselves from them, then those later systems were never fully self-made. They were recipients before they were founders, heirs before they were lawgivers. That realization can feel almost humiliating to empires, priesthoods, and intellectual orders accustomed to naming themselves as beginnings. One can see how the mind would recoil from such dependence. It is easier to imagine that the ancient world was noble but incomplete, awaiting refinement. Easier to say that earlier peoples were spiritually intense but intellectually immature. Easier to honour the past while quietly assigning it a lower place in the hierarchy of meaning. This arrangement preserves reverence without surrendering supremacy. It allows the present to appear grateful and sovereign at the same time, yet beneath that polished gesture lies an old fear. What if the ancestors were not merely preparing the way? What if they knew things differently, organised sacred life differently, held a relationship to time, sky, death, or continuity that later civilizations inherited only in fragments and then mistook for primitive beginnings? That fear may explain why certain discoveries produce not just fascination, but subtle resistance. A monument older than expected is tolerable. A pattern of repeated early sophistication is less so. An isolated anomaly can be admired. A whole cluster of anomalies that begins to suggest a deeper rethinking of origins is more dangerous. The danger is not necessarily political in any immediate sense. It is civilizational. It presses against the emotional grammar by which a society understands itself. It asks whether the present is as original as it likes to believe. It asks whether progress has sometimes been built on forgetting rather than simple accumulation. It asks whether the confidence of modernity rests partly on having narrowed the past into a shape that no longer threatens it. There is also a more intimate dimension to this. Individuals live much as civilizations do. They edit memory in order to endure. They turn chaos into narrative. They privilege certain moments as decisive and let others blur because the full truth of continuity is too painful, too complicated, too difficult to carry each day. Entire cultures do something similar. They remember selectively not only because power demands it, but because identity itself is built from arranged memory. To question foundational memory is not just to revise a timeline, it is to unsettle belonging. Perhaps that is why the first civilization feels so strangely near and far at once. Near because traces of it may survive everywhere, in symbols, flood memories, reused sacred ground, alignments, domestic patterns, myths of recovery, unexplained ritual residues, the silent testimony of seeds and stone. Far, because none of these traces survives in a form that grants easy possession. They resist closure. They refuse to gather obediently into a single polished account. And the present, which prefers what can be categorized, authenticated, and displayed with confidence, grows uneasy before anything so distributed and unresolved. Yet unresolved things often tell the deepest truths. A solved past is often a managed past. A fully domesticated origin is usually one that has been made safe for inheritance. The first civilization, by contrast, remains powerful precisely because it cannot be wholly recovered without altering the stories later ages tell about themselves. To recover it more honestly would require admitting that humanity's beginnings may have been more experimental, more interrupted, more symbolically rich, and more vulnerable than the official record has long preferred. It would require letting uncertainty remain central rather than peripheral, and uncertainty is rarely granted central authority for long. Institutions stabilize by defining edges. Education stabilizes by simplifying transitions. Religion stabilizes by sanctifying selected lines of descent. Empire stabilizes by claiming historical inevitability. Even scholarship in its most sincere form can stabilize too much when it becomes overly loyal to inherited categories. None of this requires bad faith. It requires only repetition. Over centuries, repeated simplification becomes civilization's second nature. The brokenness of origins is still there, but it is draped in forms smooth enough for ceremony. That may be the final service the first civilization still performs for the living. It disturbs ceremony. It reminds human beings that what they call the beginning may already be a reconstruction, and what they call clarity may rest upon buried ambiguity. It presses gently but persistently against pride. It suggests that civilization did not rise once and then unfold cleanly, but emerged, fractured, recovered, encoded itself into sacred forms, lost parts of its own language, and survived through inherited fragments no later age has fully mastered. There is no need to turn that into doctrine. It is enough to let the possibility remain. Beneath the maps of accepted history, beneath the temple foundations, beneath the state archives, beneath the polished language of cultural beginnings, there may still lie an older human condition, one in which memory was repeatedly broken and patiently reassembled, one in which meaning survived by hiding, one in which the first civilization was never wholly destroyed, only thinned into forms later ages could tolerate. And if that is true, then the question waiting at the threshold of the final part is no longer simply historical. It becomes uncomfortably modern. What if the first civilization disappeared not because it was weak, but because forgetting is one of the oldest tools any civilization possesses? What if every order, sooner or later, learns to survive by stepping over sealed doors, blessing the stones above them, and teaching its children that nothing important was ever buried underneath? What if every civilization learns, sooner or later, to survive by stepping over sealed doors and calling the silence beneath them peace? The thought lingers because it reaches beyond the ancient world and settles uncomfortably close to the present. Until now, the first civilization has appeared through fragments, drowned landscapes, buried sanctuaries, king lists arranged by power, flood memories, broken scripts, sacred alignments, reused ruins, domestic traces, myths carrying damaged continuity. None of these has offered a final answer. But together, they have done something perhaps more important. They have made the official beginning of history feel less like a clear dawn, and more like a late light falling across an older wound. Perhaps that is the most honest image to leave in the mind. Not a lost empire shining intact beneath the sea, not a secret archive waiting to be opened once and for all, but a wounded continuity scattered across time, surviving in pieces too humble, too sacred, too misread, or too inconvenient to gather cleanly into one accepted story. The first civilization may never have erased itself in any simple sense. More likely, it was thinned by water, interrupted by climate, translated through trauma, arranged by institutions, inherited through symbols, and softened by each later age into a form that could be born without too much instability. What disappeared was not always the evidence. Often it was the permission to see all the evidence together. That distinction matters. Human beings are very good at preserving fragments while losing wholes. A society may keep a ritual and forget the sky it once measured. It may preserve a myth and forget the ecological catastrophe that gave the myth its first pulse. It may stand upon the foundations of an older sanctuary and never ask why the place felt holy before its own language arrived there. It may repeat sacred numbers, inherited forms, inherited boundaries, inherited gestures of burial, law, purification, or kingship without remembering that these were once parts of a larger and more integrated world. The pieces survive, the pattern fades, and once the pattern fades, later civilizations no longer need to lie in order to misunderstand themselves. They need only inherit selectively. This is why the first civilization remains so difficult to recover. It is not simply hidden in one place. It has been dispersed into too many kinds of evidence at once. Part of it may sleep beneath continental shells and river sediment. Part of it may endure in ruined ritual landscapes whose original language is gone. Part may survive in undeciphered signs, in seasonal observances, in mythic compressions of flood and recovery, in local customs that outlived the systems that first shaped them. Part may even survive in the intellectual habits of later civilizations that unknowingly built on older foundations, while denying how deep those foundations ran. In that sense, the first civilization is not absent. It is over-distributed, too spread out to be owned, too altered to be restored cleanly, too foundational to remain comfortable. And perhaps comfort is the true issue. The past becomes dangerous when it threatens the emotional architecture of the present. A civilization can tolerate ancient ruins. Ruins flatter continuity. It can tolerate mystery. Mystery can be turned into tourism, symbolism, or harmless wonder. But it struggles with ancestral ambiguity. It struggles with the suggestion that its own beginning was not pure, not singular, not fully understood even by those who inherited it. It struggles with the idea that memory itself has been curated for survival, that official history may be not false but narrowed, that the deepest truths of origin may survive most clearly in the very things once dismissed as secondary. Ritual residue, marginal myths, overwritten landscapes, ordinary remains, unresolved anomalies. In this light, forgetting no longer looks like failure alone. It begins to resemble a civilizational technique, not always cynical, not always deliberate, but recurrent. A people emerging from catastrophe cannot carry everything. A priesthood charged with preserving sacred order cannot permit all meanings to remain equally open. An empire seeking legitimacy cannot afford a beginning too plural or too unstable. A modern culture built on confidence in progress does not easily welcome evidence that complexity can be lost, scattered, and misremembered for thousands of years. Each age forgets according to its needs. Each one preserves enough of the past to remain rooted, but not always enough to remain honest. That does not make humanity uniquely corrupt. It may simply make humanity human. Memory, whether personal or collective, has always been a negotiation between truth and endurance. The unbearable is stylized, the chaotic is arranged, the broken is retold until it can be inherited without shattering the next generation. In that sense, the first civilization may have survived precisely because it became unrecognizable. Its knowledge was not carried forward whole, because whole knowledge is often too heavy after rupture. Instead, it survived in disguised continuities, in forms detached from full context, in stories stripped of geography, in sacred places reused under other names, in practical habits whose origin became invisible through repetition. There is a melancholy beauty in that. Something in humanity refused total loss. Even after flood, migration, conquest, institutional narrowing, and centuries of reinterpretation, the older world still seems to breathe faintly through the cracks. A myth persists. A site refuses easy explanation. A buried enclosure appears where no one expected organized sacred labor so early. A script remains unread but unmistakably intentional. A ritual date aligns with a sky pattern older than the doctrine now attached to it. A layer of domestic evidence reveals continuity where official memory had drawn a break. Again and again, the buried world sends up small signs that it was larger than the authorized account has allowed. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the first civilization does not need to be reconstructed into a new dogma, because dogma is precisely how the deeper pattern was obscured before. It may be better to leave the matter open, though not empty. To admit that the beginning of civilization was likely more distributed, more fragile, and more recursively forgotten than the old stories of progress preferred. To admit that the earliest human order may have suffered not only destruction, but reduction, reduced into archives, into liturgies, into selected lineages, into acceptable myths, into decorative mystery. To admit that the true strangeness of the past lies not in impossible fantasies, but in how ordinary the mechanisms of erasure can be, sediment, translation, reuse, canon, reverence, convenience. And then the mind turns, almost unwillingly, toward the present. Every civilization believes that its archives are more secure, its categories more rigorous, its self-understanding more mature than those that came before. Every age imagines it has finally learned how to keep memory intact, yet the ancient world offers a quieter lesson. The greatest losses do not always occur when everything burns. Sometimes they occur when continuity seems to hold, but the centre of meaning has already shifted. Sometimes the future inherits the forms and not the understanding. Sometimes the names remain, and the world behind the names is gone. So the first civilization may still be with humanity in the most unsettling way possible, not as a solved mystery, but as a mirror. It suggests that the deepest foundations of any order may eventually become unreadable to those who stand upon them. It suggests that people can preserve a structure while forgetting why it was first raised. It suggests that history is not only the story of what survives, but of what survives under altered interpretation, and beneath that recognition rests one last gentle warning. A sealed door is never only a mark of the past. It is also a habit of mind. Somewhere under the oldest stones, beneath the layered temples, beneath the floodplains and sediments, beneath the stories polished by priests and kings and scholars and heirs, there may remain no single hidden chamber waiting to vindicate one final theory. There may remain only the patient fact that humanity began in greater uncertainty than it likes to remember, and that much of what it calls origin may already be aftermath. The first civilization, whatever its true form, may have vanished not into nothing, but into the long human practice of living above buried meanings and learning, generation after generation, to call that arrangement history. And when the night grows quiet enough, that may be the final image worth keeping. Not an answer, but a landscape. Wind moving over abandoned stone, water above drowned paths, seeds sleeping in dark soil, symbols visible but unread. A horizon aligned to a sunrise no one fully explains anymore. And beneath all of it, something older than certainty, waiting without impatience, as if the earth has always known that civilizations do not only leave ruins behind them, they leave blind spots. And sometimes the most ancient thing of all is not the monument, not the myth, not even the buried city, but the human willingness to inherit a mystery, build a world above it, and then forget, almost tenderly, that the ground was ever speaking.